Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman, and for my first video back after my week-long break of adapting to a new sleep schedule, I've decided to talk about Margit the Velomen, or Morgott the Grace Given, the Veiled Lord or the Veiled Monarch, a man of many names. Since I've wanted to make a video about him since I started making Elden Ring lore videos. Now I think all of the demigods are interesting in their own respects, especially the ones who don't appear as bosses. Some of the ones we do meet in boss form are far more interesting than others. For example, Melania, despite being the poster child for the game, isn't all that complex or interesting. She was born with the outer god of rot inside her, which I think has to do with the fact that she's the product of a single god, and because that happened, that allowed some kind of a loophole for the rot god to get in there and infect her, while Miquella was infected with some kind of perma-youth. Anyway, the only other point to her character is that she was essentially Miquella's sword and his weapon for all intents and purposes, and that she was afflicted with rot that was tearing her apart from inside out, but she fought on regardless. And yeah, that's pretty cool, but there really isn't much more to her than that. She protects her brother and carries out his will. There's nothing wrong with her character. There should always be straightforward, easy to understand characters like this. But compare that to Rykard or Morgott, or even Mog, who is just a straight up hilarious edgelord and confirmed insane person who may or may not be having his way, for lack of a better term, with Miquella's corpse. Or actually, it's not really a corpse if the developers are to be trusted. I believe they've said that Miquella is still alive, and I think game descriptions might back that up too, I just can't remember. And maybe complex is the wrong word to describe Mog, but I think it definitely applies to Rykard and Morgott. Even Ranni, with all her scheming and her sacrificing her loyal followers as chess pieces, is a pretty complex character, because on the surface we can assume that she just doesn't want to be the next Marika. But then we look at descriptions from stuff involving her mother and we realize maybe it's a little more complicated than that. Maybe I don't know, this isn't the right place to talk about that. But anyway, this video isn't about all of that. This is about Margit the Velomen. So let's start right off. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the goddess Marika, a Empyrean of the Greater Will, took the mightiest war chief of the Badlands as her consort, a warrior by the name of Horlu. And the two of them would basically conquer the entire continent like the type of power couple you'd read about in a fictional history book in a story written by George R. R. Martin. Now, after they conquered the world together, the two of them would settle down and have some kids. But much like the children of Cersei Lannister, all of these kids were cursed with a grim fate. There was Godwin, who would become a hero in his own right, only to eventually turn into a tree of sorts. I'm not going to make another A Song of Ice and Fire reference to that, but moving on to the twins, Morgott and Mog. Now, these two were born as omens, or omen, I believe the plural is. Anyway, omen were a sign of the Crucible, the age before the erdtree, and when the Golden Order was established, it decided it had no room for the omen or the misbegotten or any sign of the previous age, the Crucible. So all children who are born omen have the horns excised at birth, usually resulting in the infant's death. However, regal ones, like Mog and Morgott, were allowed to keep their horns and were instead introduced to the sewers, where they would spend their entire lives. So these two omen twins were basically raised the exact same way, kept in the sewers, but we know at least Morgott spent some time with his father, or at least spoke with him, so we can only assume that Mog also has talked to Godfrey, or Godfrey is aware of Mog's existence. I like to think that Godfrey, before he got sent away by Marika, would come to visit the twins, and that Mog wanted nothing to do with him, while Morgott and him sort of forged some type of a father-son relationship, judging by Godfrey's words to Morgott at the beginning of his fight, and Morgott later summoning a golden shade of his father to defend the crypts. But anyway, Marika would eventually send Godfrey away, rob him of his grace to go return to the Badlands to go live and die and all that, and she would recall her other half, Radon, have more kids, and start the events that would lead to the Shattering. Okay, so boom, the Shattering happens. Brought about in part because of the Night of Black Knives, but also due to a number of contributing factors. Both Marika and Radon would disappear, and she would basically say to her children, if none of you can become the next god, you will all become kindling for the fire, basically. But this left the capital of Leyndell without a ruler during a very crucial time, the start of a very brutal war with armies led by literal demigods. This is when Morgott would rise out of the sewer and be given the gift of grace. With his new power, he became the last true king of Leyndell, the veiled monarch, called so for wearing a veil to hide his horrific horns and omen disfiguration, which he himself had grown deeply ashamed of. I mean, he fully believed the Kool-Aid that was the Golden Order propaganda in the erdtree. He believed he was of cursed blood and deserved to live in the sewers, but when the opportunity arose, he was the first one to defend his home, to defend those who had shunned him, and still would shun him if they saw his face, probably. So while he led the defense of Leyndell as the veiled monarch, he would also take to the field under the disguise of Margit the Velomen, his alter ego, if you will, and was said to have piled high the bodies of traitors and those who would challenge the erdtree and the might of Leyndell. The Velomen was said to be fierce and brutal and had a number of knights who served him directly, known as the Knights Cavalry. Wearing pitch-black armor and hooded funeral steeds, these guys were a force to be reckoned with. They were essentially like the dark version of the Tree Sentinels, and they only appear at night. It is said that they were essentially the hands of the Velomen, carrying out the dark business of eliminating traitors in the night for their veiled lord. Morgott, under his Margit persona, was also known for defeating the famous General Radon, son of Radon and Renala, and hero of Celia. Though this fight appears to have taken place before Radon had grown to a massive size, and therefore possibly even before he had learned gravity magic, which makes me think that their fight was just a test of strength between the two and physical skill with weapons. But I do believe they were fighting with the full intent to kill each other. I mean, Radon showed up and tried to sack the capital, which is when I assume Godric fled, dressed up as a girl and all that, and hid away. And we know Radon didn't get to take or hold the capital, so it can be assumed that he was pushed back and defeated by Margit's forces. At the end of the day, all of this analysis just comes from one picture that we get during the opening slide, but I would argue that it is significant, and that it should be taken as literal and that it happened because the pictures we see before and after it are all things that we know happened for sure, like Mog stealing Mikola, Radon and Melania fighting, Rykard getting eaten by a snake. All these things we know happened, so why would we assume that the fight between Radon and Margit didn't happen? At some point during the Wars of the Shattering, likely during when it was getting desperate, and the forces were allowed to use stuff that used to be prohibited like fire, Margit caught wind of two banished knights, two really skilled ones that once served the Stormlord who had been defeated by Margit's own father, Godfrey. These two knights were known as the Wings of the Storm, and due to their legendary status, they both presumably had a considerable number of men following them, men that could prove useful to Margit's cause. He sent word to them and offered pardons in exchange for loyal service. One of them, Ingval, his name was, refused the invitation, choosing instead to focus on his redneck comedy tour. I'm just kidding, he just chose to watch over a Masterless Castle. The castle in question is sort of unclear, but we know it was located in the Fringe Lands, and he basically gained a lot of renown for defending this nameless castle. Although how he ended up in Murkwater Catacombs as a boss drop remains sort of unclear. But the other banished knight, Oleg, took Margit up on his offer, and was said to have slaughtered 100 traitors as his lord's hand. For this badass feat, he was awarded an erdtree burial, and pretty much a whole hero's catacomb for his men, the Fringe Folk Hero Grave, since him and his men were from the Fringes. After all of this, Margit has defended the erdtree faithfully, stood tall against its enemies. He's done everything it's asked of him and more, just especially given how he was treated prior to the erdtree needing him. But the big gold tree in the sky refuses to open up the gates for him, which I'm sure he at least somewhat attributed to his cursed blood that he hated so much, which is one of the big parallels between him and his twin brother Mog. Mog embraced his blood and had it empowered by a blood god, and Margit sealed away his cursed blood in his sword. He was so ashamed of it, he took it out of his body and hid it away in his blade, turning the weapon into a sort of walking stick mace bashing thing. A weapon that I honestly wish we got. I know we got the sword, but I wish we also got the staff mace version of it that would have been like a warhammer or something. And I think another interesting contrast between the two twins is how they're dressed. I mean, look at Mog. He's wearing extravagant robes. He's starting a new dynasty. Yeah, he might be insane, but he's dressed pretty dapper. Where Margit wears a ragged cloak and ragged pants and just rags, literal rags. When he's living at the capital, he could be dressed better. There's definitely fits he could wear that he could just, fit that awkward tail of his through. But he doesn't. He actively chooses to dress like a savage, or a wretch, if you will. And I think that's all because he doesn't believe he's worthy of dressing nice. He doesn't believe he's worthy of nice things. He believes he's cursed and deserves to live in the sewers, but since there's no one else to defend Leyndell, well, I guess it's got to be him because he's good at killing. We also know that Morgott deeply cared about his deceased brother Godwin, and that the Knight of Black Knives had a profound impact on him to the point where he would invent these sentry torches that dispelled the cloaking devices used by the Black Knife assassins, rendering their invisibility rather useless. It's a pretty useful thing to have on hand if you end up in Ordina liturgical town's Everjail. It's actually pretty fun just going around offing all 4 of those Black Knife assassins that are in there. Satisfying, if you will. From here, Morgott's story sort of stagnates. So he hears the Tarnister coming back and creates what I'm assuming are these remote-controlled shades or duplicates of himself, and sends one on down to Masterless Castle. Since the Tarnished have returned to kill the demigods, and the first demigod, and likely the weakest that most Tarnished will go after, is likely Godric. So he inserts himself right in between Godric's castle and the outside world of Limgrave, and basically just slaughters any Tarnished that's foolish enough to challenge him without being ready. He's not exactly hard, but he's more of a fun fight than Godric is, in my opinion. Defeating him here just leads to him taunting you a bit and telling you that his eyes are everywhere and that the hands will soon reach out and touch you and all this. The hands he's referring to, many believe, are the Knight's Cavalry that we see patrolling during nighttime at various parts of the game. He creates another duplicate shade of himself but hides it inside a peasant and sends the peasant over to the outer wall of Leyndell, a place where Margit himself had slaughtered countless warriors. And this shade awaits any Tarnished who were strong enough to defeat him the first time, even though he spawns even if you skipped the first encounter with Margit. His dialogue seems to suggest that you're the same one, and it's expected that you fight the other one first, but he's more of a mini-boss here. He's probably got more HP than his first encounter, but I'd say the player is likely more leveled and much stronger by this point, so they should have no problem defeating him. Now, it doesn't say anywhere that he's explicitly making shades or something, but that's really the only way I can describe what he's doing. I mean, he basically, hid a shade inside this villager, and then used the villager as a puppet, as sort of a host for the shade, and then, it resulted in the peasant's death. Not that it matters anyway, most of the peasants in this game are mindless idiots, and the ones that aren't literally try to rob you every time you die. But I'm getting off subject. Now, after fighting their way through the entire city of Leyndell, the Tarnished finally comes face to face with Margit the Velomen, the real one, not one of his puppets. Morgott has a really cool entrance here. He calmly walks down the stairs while denouncing all of the other demigods as traitors, before finally releasing his cursed blood from his blade and challenging the Tarnished to one final duel. And it's during this fight that Margit eventually resorts to using his cursed blood as a weapon, much like the perfumers of Leyndell were forced to use fire as a weapon during the wars, despite previously being unable to use it due to the taboo nature of fire when in regards to the erdtree. So about halfway through the fight, when Margit's at 50% health, he starts coughing up and vomiting blood everywhere, and then this blood turns explosively fiery, and he begins using the cursed slash, the cursed strike, the cursed stab, all of the cursed blood sword moves that his sword can do. Because at this point, he's desperately fighting to protect the erdtree, using even his own cursed-ass blood, the thing he hates most about himself, as a weapon to stop you, the player, from advancing further. And when the fighting's finally over and he lies defeated, he sees that the erdtree has also spurned the Tarnished, which is something that I think allows him to find comfort as he's dying. Realizing that he was sort of used as a tool, and that even this Tarnished was used as a tool. That it's all pointless, and he uses his final breath to further shit-talk the player, which is something I deeply respect about Margit. He talks about how no matter what he did, the erdtree never budged, and it'll be the same for us. Which, as anybody who's watching this video knows, is definitely untrue, because it's super easy to burn the erdtree. But as Morgott chuckles himself off of this mortal coil, the player proceeds and eventually runs into him one further time down the road. After scaling the mountaintops of giants, defeating the last fire giant, burning the erdtree, and even conquering the ancient forbidden city of Faramazula, the Tarnished returns to the exact spot he had defeated Morgott, and in his place he finds his dad, Godfrey, cradling the body of his deceased son, and commending him for fighting as long and hard as he did. I think this is important because it shows us that Godfrey did care about his sons and that Morgott had some sort of a relationship with his father. Before that too was sent away by Queen Marika to live and die in some far-off land. One interesting thing about the Morgott fight is that afterwards, when he's a shriveled up corpse on the ground, he appears to no longer retain his horns or any of his omen features. I can't tell, but it doesn't look like he has his tail either. And I'm not really quite sure why that is, although I could assume that it has something to do with the fact that he expelled all of his cursed blood during the fight. And now that he no longer has any cursed blood in him or near him, that he's no longer cursed, and then him dissipating into golden dust when Godfrey carries him kind of shows me that he got to return to the erdtree, which is not something that omens do. Omen, at least as far as I know, aren't able to return to the erdtree because they are cursed. They become wraiths when they die, the little golden things that they spit at people. So Morgott disappearing in rays of gold, sort of dust, kind of fading away like a Thanos snap, sort of tells me that he didn't become a wraith in death. Or it tells me that Godfrey just absorbed him, and that the grace Morgott was given was actually Godfrey's. But that's a whole theory for a whole nother day. I just wanted to talk about Morgott because I feel like he's a really cool character, and I know a lot of people made videos about him, and he deserves it. He's one of those interesting characters who deserves it. Rykard's definitely next after my big Randy video I've been talking about for months and months. But Morgott was a man, or a being, who was basically treated like shit for reasons outside his control, because he was born with horns. Shunned and forced to live in a sewer, he was only called upon by the erdtree when it needed him, and he was tossed aside just as easily. And even in the end, though, he didn't really regret any of his actions. Also, he's got some really great voice acting, and all of his lines are top tier. It's understandable why he's become one of the more popular bosses of the game. But at the risk of going on and on and on, please like, comment, and subscribe if you like my work, dislike it if you dislike it, and I will see you soon. I'll be back really soon to talk about Hot D's new episode, and again for this mystery video that I've been working on all week. That should be done tomorrow. But anyway, let's have our outro, shall we?
The erdtree wards off all who deign approach. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord. Thy deeds shall be met with failure, just as I